All right, Dean Halper, you want to give it another minute and then we can start?
Yeah, I think whenever you're ready, we're ready to start.
All right, at 12:05 we'll start, and then everybody who just hops on starts hopping on.
And we'll, Troy, I'll let Dean Smith start us off. Is that okay?
That's perfectly fine. That's cool.
Okay. Dean Smith, whenever you are ready.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this very important conversation that we're going to have this afternoon. I'd in particular like to thank Troy Dortch for organizing this event, and for our three panelists for joining us, Leah Miller, Asha Castleberry Hernandez, and Jessica Lee. So it's often said that one of the strengths of United States foreign policy is the example that we can set around the world, and that projects our power in a more magnified way than would otherwise be the case. Unfortunately, we know this isn't always true, and the examples of just 5 weeks ago and what happened on January 6th is a perfect example of that situation, or that power being tarnished or compromised. But it's not the only example. What we're going to be exploring today through the leadership of Troy and our panelists is how racial injustice can also hinder U.S. foreign policy, and in doing so becomes a national security issue. And we're really appreciative of our guests today. Troy will be introducing them formally, but I just want to take a moment to talk about the origins of this event. After the murder of George Floyd last summer, under the leadership of a group of our Black students, the School of Diplomacy formed a racial justice initiative, a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice initiative. 45 of you, many of you on this call, have been involved in this work. It encompasses faculty members, administrators, students, and alumni. And we're very grateful for the work of this group. They've done amazing things for the school already across 5 areas of activities. And this panel is a product of that. So not only is Troy an active alumni of the school, but he's a key member of this coalition. And we're very pleased that he has taken the initiative to lead this event. So what I'd like to do is turn it over to Troy to introduce our guests and to moderate the conversation. Thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to learning with you this afternoon. Troy, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Dean Smith. That was a very eloquent introduction. Just to introduce our three special guest panelists that are here. We have first Ms. Leah Miller, who is a Foreign Service Officer for the State Department. She's currently serving as the Chief of the Public Affairs Office at the U.S. Embassy in Yerevan. We have Ms. Jessica Lee, who is a Senior Research Fellow on East Asia in the East Asian Program at the Quincy Institute. And we have Ms. Asha Castleberry Hernandez, who has just recently been appointed under the Biden-Harris administration as the senior advisor in the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the State Department. But formerly, before that, she was an adjunct faculty professor at Fordham University, where she taught foreign policy and UN peacekeeping operations. So congratulations, Asha, on the new promotion, and happy to have you all. So let's kind of start. So touching on what Dean Smith had reiterated earlier in the introduction, we've had a rise in white supremacy in America and in this violence recently, especially after January 6th, and we've had a rise in it in Europe over the past few years as well. However, how has systemic racism in our national security and foreign policy affected our threat perception of threats like white supremacy, when compared to other groups like people in the Middle East, like Muslims, especially when you compare it to what happened in 9/11. So Asha, I wanted to start with you to talk about that. And you're muted, Asha.
Yes, thank you for the question. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. So for quite some time, there has been some reports coming out of the Department of Homeland Security that our number one threat right now to the United States is domestic extremism. And so we've seen some development along the way, and then evidently that was pretty apparent based on what came out in January 6th. So that outpaced what we call, terrorism overseas, especially in the Middle East. So this is definitely now the reality that we have to face. and also shaping foreign policy. So, and you're seeing right now, especially in the Department of Defense, where this is being addressed within the ranks. And this is also being addressed in many other ways. And you're going to see that this is going to be probably one of our top priorities when it comes to the release of our future national security strategy. So yes, I will just stop it there.
All right, thank you, Asha. And Leah, like going off on that, like, you know, you're actually working in the field. So how has that always affected your work in regards to threat perception or in terms of foreign policy engagement?
Thank you for the question. And I love following Asha because she always helps me get my ideas flowing. So please continue to put me after her. Yeah, I am in the field. It's true. And I can say, having served in the Middle East during Arab Spring and in the Gulf at a time when we were newly entering into the Iraq War and we were ramping up efforts in Afghanistan, it has definitely hindered our work because we no longer really have credibility to talk about terrorism and counterterrorism, because the first thing that the people that we're talking to say, well, look at what your own people are doing. Look at how polarized your nation is. How can you tell us how to do anything? And so it makes it really difficult for diplomats and other, government officials in the field to continue to promote the ideals of counterterrorism, communication, transparency, countering violent extremism, when in our country we're at a point where, as Asha said, domestic terrorism is a greater threat to our nation than external terrorism is. So it has definitely made my work extremely difficult to do, and has definitely impeded on our credibility as a nation. So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you for that. And just to kind of to touch on that, like especially seeing how the work you do in research for Far East Asia, how does that affect our credibility in trying to promote human rights over there when we see what's going on in China with the Uyghurs, and how does that, or what's going on in Myanmar with the Rohingyas, how does that affect our credibility in actually promoting like human rights when we're seeing what's happening domestically over here?
Yeah, great questions. Thanks, Troy. And it's great to be with all of you today. Thanks for organizing this panel. I think before I address your questions, Troy, I'll just say a few words about the Quincy Institute, since we're a new think tank and some of your colleagues may not be aware of who we are. So I work at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. We're an American think tank based in Washington, D.C. that was founded in December 2019. So we're a little over a year old. And we envision a world in which peace is the norm and war is the exception. And we're named after then Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, who famously warned in 1821 that America should not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, and that if we were to do that, we would risk losing America's democratic soul, our very essence. And so at Quincy, we believe that the United States must adhere to a principle of restraint, using force sparingly and only as a last resort, and that energetic and creative diplomacy, like Leah's, everyday work, has to be more of a centerpiece of our American statecraft rather than, airstrikes or building more military bases. In fact, the United States currently maintains more than 800 military bases abroad in over 70 countries. And so after COVID, I don't think there's any doubt that the United States really needs to reassess this primacy-centered, dominance-centered foreign policy. And so I guess going to your question, Troy, about how this affects our foreign policy toward East Asia, I actually co-wrote a report that lays out a new East Asia strategy for the United States that I think you had read already. But I do think that there, as Leah alluded to, and Asha as well, President Biden has said we have to focus on being a better example for the world. And that will, by nature, make it more easier to kind of export, our way of living and our values and so forth. So let our actions do more of the talking rather than our words. And I think he's right. But there is a real tension between trying to be everywhere at once. Whether it's Myanmar or in Xinjiang, and also having to take care of things at home, domestically, as Leah just pointed to. I think there's a lot of work for us to do. And so, what does that mean in practical terms? Do we just abandon foreign policy and, withdraw from the world? No, that's unrealistic, and that's not likely to happen in the near future at all. And that's not also something that we advocate at Quincy. But, there has to be, I think, more of a balance in terms of, promoting our human rights reforms and changes here at home, as well as playing a more constructive role, particularly because as Leah knows better than anyone else as a Foreign Service officer, I do think that it's hard at times to play a constructive role on human rights abuses that are taking place abroad, in part because when we do call out various aspects, there's repercussion and there's retaliation against the very people we're trying to protect. And so it's a very difficult issue that, really should be left to the diplomats and should never be politicized. But as you know, Troy, from our conversations, that, one of the things that I'm very concerned about is a very sort of this lurch toward a full spectrum competition with China that will cloud everything else that we're doing. And so I do think there's a balance to be taken here with respect to, protecting our core interests in Asia, but doing it in a way that isn't counterproductive or racialized and can be weaponized against, Asian Americans here at home as well. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I just wanted to put those things on the table. Thanks.
No, I'm glad you did. And to expand outside of China, actually, we're gonna go back to Asha, because you made a perfect point. I do agree that I think the work needs to be done at home before we can actually promote human rights abroad, and that builds our credibility abroad. But when it goes to promoting alliances, Asha, especially with the resurgence of ISIS in the Middle East and in the Sahel region, how do we work to do that in this current climate right now? How has racial injustice affected our building of global alliances, encountering these new threats?
Thank you, and Leah, thank you so much for the wonderful remarks. That's my sister right there, by the way. It's one light right now. It impacts our lives when you look at the international system right now. With regards to the international system right now, we have what we call great power competition, where for the United States, their near peer competitors is China and Russia. So when it comes to competition, they're trying to compete to get, build relationships with our alliances. So one way they do in terms of racial injustice, how that intersects, is that they communicate to our alliances saying, hey, America is a racist country. Don't work with them. We're a country that you can work with. You can trust us more. Look how democracy is not working. You don't want that to happen. We're more stable. Work with us. And another way they do this too is that they promote propaganda about our racial injustice issues. Like, for instance, when George Floyd happened, Russia played into this propaganda and promoted it everywhere. And then also when you look at, China did that. But when you also look at Russia too, Russia used it as a tool to undermine our presidential elections or our democracy in 2016. So it's definitely slides more indirect. It's not like a military invasion, but it's something that's a useful tool in terms of talking points or counting efforts as far as underlying American democracy.
Okay. Leah, as promised, you will go after Asha, so I'm gonna pivot. I'm gonna actually pick up off of that. So when it comes to doing your work in the field, again, how do you try to work to counteract these narratives that our adversaries build about us based on what's going on over here, and how has this current climate kind of hinder your development of engaging with people, especially when our credibility is everything and they're looking for you to have an understanding of their perspective?
Well, thank you for that. And after hearing Jess speak, you can also put me after her, because she also gives me lots of good ideas. So please put me after her as well. Yeah, in terms of my work on the ground and kind of finding ways to maintain U.S. credibility around these issues, the first thing, all I have to do is show up. Look at me. I am not the traditional Foreign Service officer. I'm a female. I'm a woman of color. So that in and of itself has a lot of power. So as soon as I walk in the room, the energy shifts because I'm not what they're expecting. And I embody those very values that we are trying to promote overseas. So I think if my white male counterpart went into the room to try to deliver a démarche or to talk about human rights issues, and they want to talk about what happened in the Capitol, I think that they would hear more from me on this particular issue, and they would value the weight of my words maybe a little bit more, because they know that I'm talking about it not only as a diplomat, but also as someone who is personally impacted by these policies. And I am personally invested in making sure that human rights is honored and upheld in my own country, let alone somewhere else. So what I think will help counteract some of the discredit that we've had and what our enemies, so to speak, are trying to actively work against us. And sadly, they're being very successful at it, given the state of things in America. They need more diplomats like me. They need diplomats like you. They need diplomats that look like this panel, because what we represent is the American ideal. We are what America looks like. And the Foreign Service should reflect that because of the perspectives and experiences that we bring to the table. I'll stop there.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I definitely agree. And to continue off of that a little bit, though, Jessica, back to you, because I remember even reading your research and talking, like, we need to expand a little bit outside of China in regards of engagement with allies in the Far East Asian region. And more importantly, I think part of the issue is a lack of cultural understanding of our allies in the East Asian region or potential allies. So can you talk a little bit on how that needs to change in perspective based on your research?
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think, there is something that we should definitely acknowledge, which is that, a lot of what we're talking about today are things that Dr. Martin Luther King already warned us decades ago. He warned us about this giant triplet of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism. He was also a very fierce critic of the Vietnam War, as we all remember. And he famously said that a country that invests more in military defense rather than on social, programs here at home is approaching what he called spiritual death. So I think those are all things that we should remember in terms of kind of, where we have come as a society. And in some ways, a lot of the problems that he acknowledged back then are even more acute today. So this, I think, should give us pause as to, and really force us to reckon, because I think this gets to sort of the heart of today's discussion, which is how do we even get to this point as a country? Our president of the Quincy Institute, Andy Bacevich, recently wrote an article in response to the murders of George Floyd and other Black Americans and the groundbreaking work of Black Lives Matter movement, in which he, quoted Dr. King, as I just did. But he also says something that I think, we as a community really need to think about, the community of color, which is what is the connection between, our country's increasingly militarized approach to law enforcement and the connection vis-a-vis our militarized approach to international statescraft. Maybe it's because our defense spending is relatively protected from public debate, right? Many Americans, for example, don't know that U.S. military budget is larger than that of the next 7 countries combined, and we're spending more than $6 trillion post 9/11 in Iraq and Afghanistan. In fact, we'll be making payments to veterans of these 2 wars and their families into the 22nd century. So I do think that racial justice and sort of this military-centered U.S. Foreign policy, have to be addressed because there are deep connections. And I think, as Leah alluded to, countries that we consider our allies, whether it's South Korea, Japan, or NATO countries, they're all democracies, and they're watching, what we're doing here at home. So, I do think that we need to be honest about what our shortcomings are. And finally, to your question, this is something I'd love to kind of talk more about later in the panel, but, I do think that, and I've written about this, but we've seen time and again where when you don't have diverse national security workforce, bad decisions are made, and people have blind spots. You saw this, in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, where GAO and other kind of studies revealed that we had so little Arabic linguists on staff by the time 9/11 started. Now you're seeing, in articles that Bill Burns and and others have written where we train more Portuguese speakers than Mandarin speakers. So this is sort of, what we're dealing with in terms of the anemic investment that we're making on diplomacy and foreign policy. So I think that, kind of foreshadows already some of the blind spots that we're going to have, because as Asha alluded to, we are sort of entering this period of, China, Russia, but really China, as sort of the central challenge. But do we have the wherewithal to make the right assessment, or are we inflating the threat? Or missing some aspect of the threat. So I think this is all part of the need for a more diverse workforce.
So, well, I actually want to touch on your point of the more militarization than the use of diplomacy. And I find it kind of ironic though, because it's funny because it actually does reflect a lot of our domestic policy, like you said. It seems like we're more militarized and want to use more militarized force towards nations that are of color, rather than more European or white nations. So I wanted to ask you, do you feel like that part is part of it? Again, going back to the threat perception, where we don't really view these groups of people the same as we view ourselves, in regards of we don't see them on equal footing. We feel them more as a threat just like we view other people of color as a threat here in America.
What a brilliant
You think that plays a role? I'm gonna start off with you, Jessica, but do you think that actually plays a role in our increased militarization in terms of our foreign policy, especially towards these nations?
Yeah, that's a really complex question, and I'm not sure I have the right training to do it justice. I'd be curious how Leah and Asha feel about this. But, I do think that there's a racial component, and certainly, as the language around COVID and the sort of the Wuhan, virus, China virus, Kung flu virus, all of this stuff reveals, I think there are racialized ways in which we're talking about, perceived enemies. And it has really hurt Asian Americans here at home. I mean, the numbers just kind of speak for themselves in terms of the spike in hate crimes. But, what you're asking, I think, is a little more nuanced, which is, how is that sort of, this symptom of a larger problem, in which we view, communities of color as sort of less than, right?
Right.
Whites. And, I do think as somebody who studies East Asia primarily, I do think that there's that seeps into our perception of, say, folks in South Korea and Japan who are marginalized because they don't necessarily say the things that we like, whether it's, oh, we want, there to be more of an equal alliance relationship, or why are you building this, base in Okinawa? It's very unpopular, So when allies, say things that don't align with our, our vision and what we think they should feel, I do think that there's a very immediate reaction to sort of delegitimize those voices. And, I don't think that has much to do with race, maybe a little bit, but, I think that's a larger problem of, the ways in which we discount narratives that don't really jive into a US-centric, US dominance-oriented narrative. So I think there's a racial component to it, but I don't quite have, the full story, so to speak.
No, that's fair. No, that's definitely fair. I will give you that. So, but let's try to. I want to actually pose this same question to you, Asha, and tie this in with the Middle East in regards of how we've dealt with them recently and for the past few decades.
That is a legitimate implication, and this is why my response is going to be focused on more on the way ahead. This is why there's a big push for diversity and equity inclusion, both in the private and the public sector, because there has been foreign policy practitioners and people in so many different sectors expressing that implication. And that's why the sad thing about George Floyd's death is that it happened, but the good thing is that it's more energized and has been able to open up the forum to be very comfortable to talk about these type of issues. So the big push for diversity, for inclusion, is to talk about this concern. How can we address it moving forward?
And Leah, as promised, you're going after both Asha and Jessica again. So I'm posing the same question to you. And you worked in a plethora of different regions, whether it be the Middle East, Latin America, Asia, and I think Africa as well. So I'm asking the same question. Do you see that, especially now you're actually working indirectly in the field?
Yeah, I do. And a lot of what both of my fellow panelists said is spot on, in the sense that I don't know if the approach that the United States specifically takes is a racist one, but I think we can't avoid our past. And race has been part of America since its inception. So I think until we confront the issue of racism, systematic, institutional, all types of racism, and find a way to actually realistically confront it with meaningful action steps, it's going to always color and taint the work that we do when we look overseas. And I do agree that the approach that we take, both militaristically as well as in the diplomatic spaces, does vary based on country and region. I don't know if it's so much a racialized paradigm, but I do think that there's a bit of an elitism in that. Maybe it's economic elitism, because the way in which we interact with European nations, for example, is much more as allies, people who are on equal footing, than the way we approach African nations or Latin American nations or certain East Asian nations, or anywhere really, other parts of the world. I do think that to some extent there's a perception in those places that are still maybe at a more nascent stage of their own democratic development or economic development, that we do have some value add that we can provide. And of course we do, but I don't know that our approach needs to be so different than the way in which we approach people who may be more economically equal to us. Or, places like in Western Europe, the types of economic conversations and dialogues we are having, the types of initiatives that the United States wants to enter into with those nations is very, very different than the types of agreements that we want to enter into with other nations. And I think until we can be honest about that and have those conversations and acknowledge that our approaches are different and that our approaches might need to change, we're going to continue to butt our heads against the wall, or, because we're not going to change. Ultimately, the work won't be any different if we don't take a different approach.
Right. No,
So
absolutely.
I'll stop there.
No, absolutely. I mean, if you kind of look at how even we deal with foreign aid, it's different with how we dealt with Europe, especially when we did the Marshall Plan compared to our development and how we help, East Asia again, Africa and Latin America. So there is definitely some contradictions in our policies. But all of you talked on there needs to be more representation and more diversity in both the private sector and public sector. So I wanted to ask you. I'll start with Asha first. I'll start with Asha first because I promised Leah. Like me and you talked specifically in regards of how African American community and even to a certain extent Latin American community here in America don't feel foreign policy or international relations is as sexy as other topics. And my question to you is, how do we actually get them engaged where they feel like it's relevant or it matters to them and they want to be more engaged?
Yes, this is a great question. First, you got to look at the economy. It's now considered a global economy.
Mm-hmm.
And within the global economy, there's a lot of economic opportunities. And what you're seeing in the African American community is an uptick in economic literacy and involvement. And but right about now, most people are thinking more domestic on how they can economically empower themselves. But I think eventually you'll see the next level where they start to look at it more in a global sense. And then they're also being more exposed to the economy through investing and I hate to say this in cryptocurrency. I mean, I'm not promoting it. You should do that. But there's some sort of exposure of the global economy there, so they have easier access. And last but not least, you saw an uptick in this too in the hip hop community, where I think you had T.I., Roland Martin, Dr. Boyce Watkins visit Ghana to talk about opportunities on how they can invest in Ghana economically, because Ghana said, hey, China's running around here, and we would like more African Americans here to invest in the country too as well. So it's coming along. It needs to be more part of the mainstream topics, but it's coming along. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so economics is definitely a way to target them. And Jessica, like you kind of pointed out again in your research how like the tone has kind of turned people from the Asian community off, possibly from joining the Foreign Service or even having people in the Foreign Service actually recruit them. So what's your perspective on all of that? And then you actually had experience on working on Capitol Hill when you first started. So how does the lack of diversity in there affects decision making going out?
Yeah. I think one thing that, more and more Asian American diplomats and folks in government have noticed is that, as we talk about China as this all-encompassing threat, there is going to be more discrimination against Asian Americans and this sense of othering. Right, that we're somehow foreign, even if we've lived here for, even if we're like third generation, Asian Americans. And in the article that I'm happy to share with the group, I had cited, Con Nguyen, who is the former vice president of the Asian American Foreign Affairs Association and a FSO, like Leah, Foreign Service officer. He said in his writing that questions of loyalty and patriotism have a disproportionate impact on U.S. government officials of Asian descent. So that right there gives you a sense of, I think some of the challenges, practically speaking, of Asian Americans who want to enter government, because, we need to get security clearance, and, there are a lot of, I think, things that could be perceived, as sort of, suspicious or whatever. And I think that's true if you're a recent immigrant or whatever, but, particularly in this climate where the conversation is so toxic, I do think that is a problem that we need to talk about. I just, just by way of background, I've been in Washington for 12 years. I started on Capitol Hill, like you said, and I remember being one of the only Asian American, Hill staff for about 6 years. And, it, as I think Leah, noted rightly, it does say a lot when you walk into a room and, you carry an American diplomat passport and you're representing America. And this is sort of the best of what, we consider in terms of our vision of a multicultural, society. And, so after seeing what happened on the 6th, in terms of the Capitol Hill insurrection, that just kind of broke my heart. And it just showed me that there's going to be even more of a barrier for people of color to feel accepted and safe, right? In the halls of Congress. So I do think this is a bigger question that definitely transcends beyond the Asian American community in terms of, how we define Americanness, and, how we help more communities of color, more people like you and me, not only enter, the foreign affairs kind of field, which is also incredibly hard. Typically, people have traveled extensively, speak another language. I mean, these are all things that require money, frankly. And so, you're sort of competing against people like that, right, and trying to not only enter the field, but then also advance. So you need to kind of build up even more experience as you go in terms of travel and knowledge, global affairs. So it's hard. There's no sugarcoating it. But at the same time, there are people who have already gone through that path who can offer strategic advice, open doors, et cetera. So I don't think it's as bleak as, maybe I felt, when I first started. But, there's definitely, I think, a lot more work to be done across the board.
No, absolutely. And you did touch on a good point in terms of just economics in itself being a critical issue, which I think talked on Asha's point. I do want to go off on this too with asking Leah, because you actually had a different, and bless you, by the way, because I said that you sneezed. You actually had a different background entering in here, because you actually didn't study international relations or I don't think political science when you first started. You actually had a social worker's background. So what's your take on actually recruiting people that have a different background outside of international relations and getting those people recruited and the need for them to be in the field?
Thank you for blessing me, first of all. My background is different. I do have a master's degree in international relations, but my academic training is primarily in social work and African American studies. That's what I got my bachelor's degree in. I have a master's of social work, and I'm really glad that you asked me this question, because I actually do have a bunch of resources that I can offer right now that will help. I see a lot of people in the comments are talking about how can they enter into the Foreign Service or how can they learn about it. I came into the Foreign Service through a fellowship program called the Thomas R. Pickering Graduate Fellowship Program. And that program is specifically targeted to people from historically marginalized groups. Mm-hmm. I know we often kind of boil the issue of diversity, equity, inclusion to people of color, but obviously it's broader than that. So these programs aim to bring in people from different parts of the United States that are traditionally underrepresented. So geographic diversity, religious diversity, sexual orientation, gender diversity, and obviously racial diversity, and most importantly, socioeconomic diversity. These programs are geared towards bringing in non-traditional applicants to the Foreign Service. Of course, you have to be qualified. You still have to put in the work. You have to do well in school. You need to take advantage of opportunities to learn about the area that you want to go into. But the thing about the Foreign Service and what the Foreign Service needs more of is not a bunch of foreign policy wonks. They already have that in spades. What they need is people who bring a diverse background and different academic trainings, different experiences, people who have worked in other professions and then bring that, professional experience and knowledge into the Foreign Service, because we are truly representing all of America. So America's story isn't just people who study political science, international relations. Yes, admittedly, those are the traditional fields, and those definitely help you and give you a leg up in competing and kind of help you feel more comfortable right from the beginning because you already are somewhat aware of the issues. But it wasn't like an obstacle for me not having had that background or that academic preparation. I think anyone who goes to college, even at the undergraduate level, you are sufficiently prepared for the type of critical analysis and critical thinking, researching, communication skills that you need to be successful in the Foreign Service, and you do get training along the way. I think one of the things that's missing, and my panelists have already kind of mentioned this, there's no pipeline for people like us. And so that is the problem. A lot of us just don't have the exposure as younger people when we're kind of figuring out what do we like, what do I not like, what am I interested in? international affairs, foreign policy, national security isn't typically fields that we're exposed to unless you have a family member who happens to be in the federal government, works on the Hill, was in the military. And even then their perspective can be different. So I think what needs to happen more is that there needs to be greater development of this diverse pipeline of people starting at the youngest ages. And there is an organization that I'll put in the chat box unless someone else is listening, because I see people putting things there. So thank you for doing that, Martin and others. There is this consortium of organizations called the Global Access Pipeline. And I was the co-chair of that for several years. And what that organization does is it brings together nonprofits, think tanks, and academic institutions who are all working in the international affairs, foreign policy, national security space to create this needed pipeline that will bring in diverse candidates to not just the Foreign Service, but also international affairs agencies in general, the intelligence community, and other, just government service with an eye on foreign affairs. So Global Access Pipeline is a place to start. In addition to the Thomas R. Graduate Fellowship Pickering, or the Pickering program that I did, there's also the Charles B. Rangel program. I see that someone put that in the comments. There's also the Thomas M. Paine program, which is aimed at bringing in development professionals to USAID, which also needs to be diversified further, because one of the things that they need to overcome is the stigma of being a colonial development agency. And so there are a lot of other resources that I'm happy to share and talk about offline. I don't want to derail this, but there are a lot of efforts being made in this space to appeal and attract people like us, people with different academic backgrounds, people from different socioeconomic origins into the Foreign Service and into international affairs. So I'll stop there.
Well, no, actually continue, because I wanted to ask you, to follow up on that, what's your perspective on how to build a pipeline like that? Since you have
so many perspectives. So you about to get into some trouble now, because I'm gonna keep going. The way to do it is, even if it's at a one-to-one level, I am a huge proponent of mentorship, sponsorship, giving back, and reaching back as I climb up. So every time I want to kind of get to the next level, I'm looking at who can I bring with me. And I'm not necessarily looking at only other Black women. I'm looking at people who are hungry, eager, people who want to make a difference, people who I feel like we're kind of like-minded. So I'm a huge proponent of that. And that's one way to create a pipeline, is to take the time to go back and talk to the younger people in your life. There's a program in the State Department called the Hometown Diplomats Program. And that program gives Foreign Service officers an opportunity when we come home for vacations, or if we're on break, or if we're domestically based between assignments, to go back to our old high school, go back to our university, and talk to the next generation of Foreign Service officers from our personal perspectives. The idea is that we're going home. So we're going back to our home communities so that they recognize themselves in me or you when you go back and talk to them, and they see this as a possibility for themselves. And so I think that's one way to do it. I also think organizations like Women, WCAPS, Women of Color Advancing Peace and Security, ICAP, I can't remember all these acronyms right now, but there's a lot of organizations out there that are working on promoting exactly what we're talking about, creating a community, a diverse community of foreign affairs, foreign national security, foreign policy professionals that don't look like the typical norm. Another way that I think we need to do it is to be a little bit more proactive. Don't be afraid to reach out to someone who is working in areas that you are interested in, and have an informational session with them. Reach out and have a coffee with them. You'd be surprised, as busy as people are, they genuinely do care about this, and people will make time to give you a coffee or to give you some advice, and then be persistent and keep in touch with them, recognizing that these people are busy. They may not be able to email you back right away, but they will come back to you. And if they don't, move on from them and go to the next person. The last thing that I'll say with respect to opportunities is also look for internship opportunities. The State Department offers many. There are internships on the Hill. There's internships in pretty much every interagency agency or institution. So speaking from the State Department perspective, I would recommend going to careers.state.gov. And on that page, it talks about the different career paths. It talks about the fellowship programs I've already mentioned, and other internships and other opportunities to learn about the Foreign Service. And another way to create this pipeline, trying to answer your question, is there's also opportunities for academic exchange, overseas exchange programs. I think that's a great way to kind of dip your toe into this arena as a younger person in high school. Go and live overseas for a year, go overseas for a semester. It will change your world, and your global perspective will be forever altered by this amazing experience that you have. Or if you're unable to travel, host a student from another country at your house and let them live with you. And I think through these sort of mechanisms, that pipeline will be developed. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. You definitely gave us all the blueprint, and I think you found your job after you leave the Foreign Service. Asha, because you also have experienced a little bit in this too. Like, I wanted your perspective on that too, just to touch off.
Oh, can you hear me? Great.
Yeah, we can. Yeah,
that was wonderful. She pretty much spoke out a lot, but my pipeline was different. You know, I came into the armed services during the Bush administration, and boy, that was scary. You know, because there were so many people, so many young people that were, you know, going to war. But the one thing I would tell you when it comes to the military, that a lot of people don't know this. First of all, there's a lot of ROTC programs at different schools. And most people don't really know what the military offers you, or they think, oh, that goes to people who can't make it in the real world. But in actuality, when it comes to the military, they offer you great experiences to travel, to work with the State Department, become a foreign area officer, to also acquire a STEM skill. Like right now, there's an uptick in cybersecurity, going into engineering. So, you know, there is a high caliber of things you can do in the U.S. military. So, and it's so easy to join in your institution. But I think a lot of people just don't know about the opportunities that they're offering. And you can go in as active duty or a reservist and get a lot out of it, where the government pretty much supports you to become a trained military professional. Another thing too that helped me with my career was actually studying abroad at 19 years old to China, where I learned about the developments of China after the 1979 economic reform under Deng Xiaoping. That was not easy for me, but I learned from a friend that I went with from Harlem. She was able to raise a lot of money to be able to go there from her church, from her community center. And also it requires a lot of planning. You just can't just say, I want to study abroad off the cuff, and then you expect to have a lot of money from them, especially if you come from a low middle class. Can't really necessarily do that. But it's definitely worth it. You know, I know the circumstances are very tough, tough right now with regards to Corona, but you should definitely get out there and learn, because just like Michelle Obama said, I'd rather travel 10,000 miles, learn about a country, than read 10,000 books. So it's definitely worth it to get yourself out there. And the United States is having a hard lesson right now that a lot of us do not necessarily have a global perspective. But going back to like internships, a lot of us are like mid-career or trying to break into the mid-career field. So fellowships, there's a lot of them out there. We meet you that halfway of being either junior to senior. There's lots of fellowships out there where whether it's from think tanks or young professional organizations that you should get involved in. Some of them are paid, some are not, but definitely worth it, to where you start to meet the next generation networks, where you can also link up with organizations like WCATS, Diversity and National Security Network. There's more of those resources versus when I was coming up. And last but not least, still look into more paid fellowships. I know they recently passed internships. I know they recently passed a bill saying that more internships need to be paid. So it's still something that you should consider down the road, especially in graduate school. And last but not least, look into local organizations that you can be part of, like UNA USA, where they have outreach programs where they come to community centers and teach people in the local area about United Nations. They teach them about foreign policy, national security. So something that you can also bring into your hometown. So that's something to think about. Thank you.
No, thank you on that. I definitely agree with the paid internship part. That's speaking from my background, and like definitely thank you for pointing out that there are resources out there. Jessica, I want to actually ask you the same question, because you have experience on this as well, especially working with the Council on Korean Americans. So can you give your perspective on that?
Sure. I think, after about 6 years on the Hill, I moved on to a community-based organization, as you just noted, for 4 years, where I worked mostly with Korean Americans across the country to try to educate them on issues and build more of a sense of community. And one of the programs that I started was a scholarship program for college students of Korean descent to be able to intern on the Hill and elsewhere, in Washington related to public service. And so this is a program that, we got a lot of interest in and was able to give, each student a fairly substantial stipend to help them. And I help, place the students as well. So I have experienced both kind of in participating in programs, but also implementing and building up, internship programs and scholarship programs. So I think, as both speakers just said, there are a lot of programs that I think make it easier. One of the things that I did earlier on, when I first started in Washington, first of all, don't be discouraged if you can't find something while you're not living in Washington, because that was something I struggled with as I was finishing my graduate program. It was kind of hard to kind of break in from afar. And though I tried to network with alums and folks in my network, it was pretty challenging. And I suspect with COVID, it's even more difficult. But, as Leah said, reaching out to people by email, just making it really brief, your request, just say 15 minutes of your time, that usually gets busy people to stop what they're doing and actually, rather than say, I just want have this open-ended conversation with you and make you fall in love with me, because these people just don't have the time to kind of be very abstract. So you got to be really direct about what you want, the impression you want to make and the specific advice that you're asking. Then you can get the outcome you want. So I think that's just something to remember, and a mistake I made over and over again, because I was not getting the access to people that I wanted to talk to. So don't make the mistakes I made. Reaching out to people like Leah and Troy, who are clearly in the network of various people that you're eventually going to be working with and whatnot, learning from them, reading their bios, looking up the programs we talked about, I think all makes sense. I think one thing to remember too is that there is more of an effort in the Biden administration, it seems, to recruit and really, put equity and diversity and inclusion as a center piece in thinking about the national security workforce, as Asha, said very clearly in the beginning. So, I think playing up the fact that you're different from other people is smart. It's also like it's true, because we are different. So it has the benefit of being true, but it's also like, you got to remind, people who are typically reviewing, applications that don't look like you, why your perspective matter and how there's value add to bringing you on. And so not being shy about spelling those things out, obviously it's a little awkward to like sing your own praises and be like, these are the 3 things that you don't have that I bring to the table. But sometimes people need to be reminded, because I notice in my, organization, like most of the people I work with are white. And it's not that they, want to be ignorant of my lived experience, but like they just don't think about it. And so, for example, there was recently, an elderly Asian American person in San Francisco who was, violently pushed for no reason, and this just kind of, became sort of a part of this outrage that, Asian Americans are feeling about being targeted, racially profiled and stuff. Anyway, so I said that to a colleague, and she was like, oh my God, I didn't know that was still happening. And I was like, what? Like, what do you mean that's still not, like, did you think this would go away after Trump? Or like, what do you mean? So I think, when you're not a person of color and you're not a community that feels attacked or marginalized, it's really easy to just like think everything's all right, and like I just had a really kind of a heart to heart with her to like be like, actually, like things are getting worse, and like, and she understood. But all to say, I think there is that, we need to give, allies, I think, benefit of the doubt that they just don't think about these issues as carefully as we might, and that there are advantages to bringing more people, communities of color along, with you when you are calling for various, changes, whether it's on the policy level or whatnot.
Absolutely, I think creating dialogues is kind of the first step in doing that. So kind of to touch off on everything you guys talked on, especially you, Jessica, because you said one thing was global. You said Americanness is not what defined in one particular way. What are the benefits of having diversity in the foreign policy and national security field, and how do you think that can project America going forward, especially under this new administration that seems to be open to it? So Jessica, I'll go with you first. Asha, you next, and then Leah. As promised, you go after both of them, as always.
Well, I think, the United States is such a rich country in terms of diverse and just multiculturalism. And that is such an attractive thing for the world, and for a long time, I felt so much kind of that sense of, that truth really weighed in a very positive way for me. And it was a driving force for me in this field, because I felt like, as Leah said, like, you just make a statement right off the bat when you enter a room and you look the way you do and your hair is the way it is. Like, I don't look like your typical white American diplomat or your, typical white think tank person. So, that is a statement. That's a powerful statement. And that should really energize and motivate all of us, right? Because this is what America looks like. And, I think the more we create space for diverse voices, the better. What I spend most of my time thinking about at Quincy Institute is not so much racial diversity, though obviously, as we talked about, it matters in the context of a militarized foreign policy, but how we build awareness of this connection between militarism here at abroad and here at home. And I think, that is something that I think about a lot, and hopefully we'll have more communities of color, who have experienced discrimination or are sort of affected by this, militarized posture, to speak up and to be in platforms and have the national kind of coverage and such, to legitimize their voices rather than delegitimizing them and marginalizing them as sometimes we do. So it's a really tough battle because, I think there is sort of this unspoken assumption that, the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization, is the must-pass bill. We got to pass it, $700 billion a year, because it's a must-pass bill. And then on like State Department authorization bill, which is what I worked on, it's like, who cares? Who cares if we haven't passed one in 20 years? So there's this very lopsided, privilege and prioritization of military over non-military aspects of our statecraft. And that's sort of what, I think we're living with right now in terms of grappling with how we got here, why the law enforcement is so militarized, why, it's so expensive and costly to maintain global dominance everywhere, et cetera. So I hope there are not just racial and ethnic diversity in these conversations, but people who bring different perspectives, because I think Asha's right. When you've lived abroad, your family, or kind of recently immigrated from abroad, you tend to see the world not just through a U.S. centric prism, but through sort of outside prism as well. And that's vital, because that's what diplomacy is. If you can't do that, you're not going to convince your counterpart on anything. They're just going to think you're an arrogant person, and self-centered person. That's not what diplomacy is. So you have to be able to see the world through the outside. And, I think people of color, recent immigrants, et cetera, intuitively get that. And that's what I think makes us really unique and powerful, really, in the, statecraft arena.
Thank you for that. Definitely. Asha, you're up.
Sorry, did you want me to elaborate? I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was saying you're up. You could touch off on what she has said. I asked, tying in everything you guys had talked about, how do you think how do you think diversity and inclusion will help in America's benefit America's foreign policy and national security, and help it to propel forward?
Oh yes, thank you so much for this wonderful question. That is something I've been working on for for now 3 to 4 years, and I would tell you the word inclusion is very important because when you think about it in terms of science, right? If you are trying to formulate a solution, a policy solution, you formulate a policy solution with a homogeneous community versus a heterogeneous community, you're going to get more effectiveness through that heterogeneous community because they'll be able to maximize your perspective, look at it in so many different dimensions. So it's very important that we look at an issue in so many different dimensions, because that's going to help us develop a more effective solution. So historically, we have not been, there's been a struggle in terms of reaching that efficiency because it's been more homogeneous. But now, because there's a more call on for diversity, equity, inclusion, we're trying to reach that strategic goal of including more. So when we look at a perspective, we're going to look at it differently and combine our school of thoughts and be able to effectively formulate a solution. And that's needed when you look at the 21st century, because the 21st century international system is more complex. Right. The threats are different or rapidly changing. In order to keep up with that rapidly changing international system, you need different perspectives included when it comes to foreign policy decision making or foreign policy making. And so you can no longer do it homogeneous, or it's almost like you're shooting yourself in the foot. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And Leah, can you expound on just what both of them have said? Because I know you have a perspective on that.
I do, and I always appreciate this spot because I love listening to my fellow panelists. They are both amazing and have so much wonderful information to share. Going back to the point that Jessica made about multiculturalism being one of the strengths that the United States have, we do. It is one of the most, I think, attractive things about the United States, that we're actually one of the few nations, despite our struggles with multiculturalism and racial diversity and diversity in the broadest sense. And we're a model of what I think an ideal should be or could be. And we're also very threatening and scary because of our multiculturalism to nations that don't value that priority. Like Russia, for example, some of the propaganda that they use is to say, well, look over there, democracy is breaking down. Look what happens with diversity over there. You need strong central leadership where we can manage all of these things so you don't have to deal with problems like this. Mm-hmm. Why? Because they see it as a threat. Why? Because it works. It's behind what makes us so successful. And as Asha was saying, our approach should be from a heterogeneous, pool of experience, mm-hmm. perspectives, lived experiences. And I think we need to continue to move in that direction because whether we want to or not, that's the direction our country is moving in. We're only going to become more heterogeneous as time goes on, between just interracial relationships, more immigration. That's never going to stop. I mean, America is the land of immigrants. Mm-hmm. So, we kind of have a homogenous culture in the sense that overall American culture, obviously there's subcultures that are, specific to different groups, and we definitely have an American brand and value sets and things that we export and we promote, but we're heterogeneous, as is the world. And I think, the level of interconnectedness we all have is only going to increase. You see how connected people are despite the global pandemic. I'm sitting here in the basement of my house in Armenia and I'm still connected to all of you. So this is the way of the world. So I think we need to embrace it or we're going to be left behind. So I'll leave it there. But I did want to say two other things before I forget. There's one more resource that I forgot to mention. When I was in ICAP, I also was organizing 3 years consecutively, the international, it was kind of with CFR based in Washington, D.C., they had an annual conference about diversity in international affairs. Mm. And that event was very, very important and was directly created to bring together younger people who don't necessarily come from backgrounds that expose them to careers in international affairs with the most senior leaders, like former Secretary Susan Rice, like Colin Powell. I mean, we're talking the top of the top of the top, Condoleezza Rice, all kinds of different leaders. And that is still happening. So if you're interested, I would recommend going to the CFR Washington homepage and look up the annual conference in diversity and international affairs. It continues to go on all the time, each year, annually, usually in the spring. And sometimes they'll even pay for people who may not have the money to attend. So there's no obstacle to participation. So I just wanted to put that out there, and I'll stop there.
Definitely shout out to ICAP because they definitely were happy when I told them that you were going to be on the panel. So they definitely put their support behind you. I say that, well, you guys touched on it. This is how diversity really can help and inclusion really can help America go forward. That is our greatest strength, ironically, but right now it's our greatest weakness. But if we can find a way to fix it, this is what can make America, again, a lead nation and a nation that everybody wants to seek for leadership and help and want to be. But off on that, we're going to actually now open it up to the Q&A session. So we can look at the chat and see where the questions at. I know Dean Halpin has been, handling that. So
there are lots of questions in the chat. So let me start by asking one of the questions I thought was interesting is about recruiting and then retention of mid-level professionals. That, we spent a lot of time talking about how to increase the pipeline for entry-level professionals. But people were asking in the chat about how do we recruit more diversity among mid-level professionals and how do we retain those people, because there seems to be a bleed in that area. So I'm interested in anyone's thoughts on that.
I'm happy to go first this time as the resident career foreign service officer, if we're talking specifically about the State Department. There's been a lot of conversations about this because of the overall racial reckoning that's happening in the United States, and especially the State Department is really taking a critical and hard look at itself and how it can be a better environment to retain the talent that it worked so hard to attract. I completely agree with whoever in the comments was saying that there needs to be more emphasis on retention. Honestly, to me, that's the biggest problem that the State Department has. It will never have a problem attracting talented individuals who want to come and work for the State Department. The problem is, can they keep them? People like me who have stayed in as long as I've stayed in isn't because the State Department is so great. I'm not saying it's all bad, but it's because I personally am committed to my work. I love what I do. I know that I'm making a difference. I get fulfillment from the work that I do. I appreciate the ability and the opportunities, the ability to live overseas and the opportunities that come with this lifestyle. I really appreciate what it's been doing to my family and my friends' networks as I'm exposing all of them through my life to other types of living, what it's like to live abroad, et cetera. But I think that the department definitely needs to spend a lot more time, as well as the broader, Congress as well, because all of our funding for all of these initiatives that I've been discussing and sharing, it all comes from Congress, need to think about ways to do that. I've heard and seen articles going around of, career foreign service officers like Linda Thomas Greenfield and others, different senators, Joaquin Castro among others, talking about creating a pipeline into the foreign service at the mid-level for people who have other experience that would be valued or coming in for a term limited time to kind of fill staffing gaps. I think that's going to be a hard sell in the department because it would potentially disadvantage those career officers who've come in and worked their way all the way up the ranks to suddenly have someone come in from the outside and be placed in a position that they've had to wait years to get to because of the current promotional structure that the State Department has. But I definitely think that there needs to be conversations about that. And I think that the department needs to do more to invest in its own people to make sure that they want to stay and then it's a place that they feel supported and where they see that they can successfully rise to the most senior ranks of the foreign service. I think what we see is, as you mentioned, this bleed at the mid levels, specifically of people of color and specifically women. And so the department, I think, actually needs to take the time to figure out why. Why is this happening? What are the root causes? Because it may not be what we think. It may be that, hey, they're at a point in life where life responsibilities are starting to become more demanding. They're starting to have children. Maybe their parents are starting to get into a space where they need more elder care. It could be a whole host of reasons. It may not even be State Department environmental reasons, though I do think it is some of that. I think the other problem is that for many people of color or people from historically marginalized groups in the State Department, we don't see ourselves in the senior most leadership. So we don't see a way to get there. We don't have mentors that look like us that come from our same background. It doesn't mean that there aren't good leaders there. It doesn't mean that there aren't people who can't mentor us despite being from a different demographic. It just means it seems a little bit harder for us to envision ourselves in those positions when there isn't anybody like us in them. So having appointees is great, but for career officers, they're not the people that we're looking to model our careers after, because we're going to be there when they arrive. We're going to still be there when they leave. So we need to see more opportunities for career advancement, career development, promotion of the people within the Foreign Service to those senior ranks. This isn't to disparage our appointees. We love them and we appreciate the fresh perspectives and experience that they bring. But I think that there needs to be specific efforts made to accelerate the careers of foreign service officers that show the potential and readiness to serve at higher levels. I'll stop there because I know my fellow panelists have more to add. Hope that helped.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to address this question?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead. No.
Okay.
You go ahead.
Well, mine will be really short. So my DoD perspective, you'd be surprised based on the recent criticism about domestic extremism. DoD actually has been the leading agency when it comes to diversity, and one reason is because we had the advantages of recruiting Americans from everywhere, and so we're the largest employment mechanism when it comes to national security. And then when it comes to like retention, the system is a lot more friendlier in promoting what promotions is huge. So retaining is, I would say, a lot more easier. And then also too, there's a lot of sponsorship and mentorship going on in the U.S. military. Now, the one problem we do have is that when it comes to people of color, some of it tends to skew to certain positions like administrative or logistical positions. You see more people of color there versus intelligence or combat arms or like cybersecurity, where it becomes less diverse. So that's been somewhat of a problem too as well. And then also what kind of hinders the when you want to get really up there in the ranks, and as far as becoming a flag officer, general officer, it tends to be more heavily in favor of the academy graduates or the West Pointers, the Annapolis folks. So now you're starting to see more changes where you're seeing where, like for instance, among Black officers, they're definitely reaching out more to retain and promote to the highest bidder from HBCUs or, you know, schools like where Colin Powell comes from. So we've always been, for many, many years, working on the diversity issue as far as retaining and promoting them up. And the way the system works has been somewhat friendly. I mean, there are some challenges, of course, but it's a overall friendly system in terms of promotion and retention.
Thank you. Jessica, I know you were going to speak up too.
Yes, thank you for the question. I don't have much more to add beyond what Leah and Asha said, but I guess from a congressional and I guess more recently think tank, perspective, I think on the congressional side, the barrier for kind of advancing, I think in general, is much more straightforward. It's like all about experience that you built on the Hill. There's nothing that could really replace it because the Hill is such a unique place. But on the think tank side, I think one of the things that I've noticed is that folks who typically ascend from mid to senior level, leadership level, by and large have PhDs. And, we don't have enough time to go over sort of the pros and cons of getting, investing in 5, 6, 7 years of your life and getting a PhD and what sort of circumstances would allow someone to do that versus others. For me, it was not a decision I could have made. That's why I only have a master's degree. And, I think that's really tough because particularly international relations PhD field, I don't see a lot of diversity at all. The professors who teach the classes about grand strategy, IR, foreign policy, even East Asia, are not, people who look like me. And so I think that's a challenge. And, as we think about ways to advance more diverse, people to leadership roles in national security, that's something that we'll have to contend with. Because if you're going to be putting a cap on and saying, look, you need a PhD to do X, Y, and Z, that automatically makes, most of the people, I'm generalizing here, but disadvantages, I think very qualified minority candidates who just maybe didn't have the luxury of being quarantined for 7 years in a university. They needed to make money, they needed to support their family, they needed to do the X, Y, and Z. That was the case for me. So it's tough because I'm seeing that as again, kind of get to sort of the top level, by and large, you're competing with people who have PhDs, and by and large, you're not, from communities of color. So we need to be thinking about these things, I think, a little more intentionally, rather than, sort of think, okay, well, then I guess I'm never going to be at that level because, I didn't spend my 20s going to grad school. I mean, there are other things that we bring to the table that I think are equally valuable that should be, I think, elevated as a core strength.
Thank you very much. So there are a couple of questions. If we go back to talking about, building the pipeline from the start, there are a couple of questions in the chat about introducing foreign diplomacy as a concept in public schools. So to help build career awareness. And your thoughts on that? How can that be done? How should it be done? And there was another question about I think at the university level about studying processes, the processes and injustices in the frame of diplomacy. How does one study the challenges that we're talking about here today?
I'll address bringing the curriculum to the local level. Is that okay? Okay.
Please go ahead.
Sure. Okay. So I've actually worked on this in the past, and one thing that I think that some of our school systems don't necessarily do well is that they don't really find out what their alumni are doing, and if they could be in the foreign service or involved in foreign policy, and bring them back into the school system to teach and talk to the students. Sometimes you'll see it and sometimes you don't. And I think that's very important. And not only bring them back to speak to the students, but also have a kind of conversation about bringing more people to speak to address the students or work with students, and also look at the curriculum to provide material that can be useful for them, especially material that involves practitioner experiences. We double down a lot on theory. I get it. That's very important, but also the students need to learn more from, practitioners. And I like what the last panelist mentioned, that outside of a PhD, there's other characteristics or assets or skill sets that are just as useful, and students need to learn more about, and it needs to be treated more invaluable, like a PhD. So, having a conversation with the practitioners about, what can we add on to the curriculum. And then last but not least, the last point I wanted to say as far as this is also working with local organizations like United Nations Association to help, bring in those guest speakers and also go over a curriculum. And I think that would be really helpful over time. Thank you.
I'll just add in, if you can hear me. I don't know if you can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. I was just going to say that I started to mention this a bit earlier, that there's a program called the Hometown Diplomats Program through the State Department and the Public Outreach Office. And that's kind of what it's intended to do, in terms of not only going back to your local high schools, but you can also go back to the elementary schools and talk to the teachers and see if there's ways that you can engage with even younger students in communities where you come from in the foreign service. And there's no limitation to that. When I'm overseas, I'm over here with my kids and my husband, and I often will visit their school, and I'm often brought in for career day and things like that informally, where I'll talk about careers in the foreign service and try to expose new communities to what we're doing. But I definitely think there's opportunities in that space. And again, when I mentioned earlier about the Global Access Pipeline, there are several organizations in that consortium of organizations that are only focusing on the elementary school age child, and trying to expose them to international affairs, foreign policy, foreign countries. I think there is a lot of space for room to develop curriculum around this. I think, world history and geography and all those types of things need to be emphasized again in a way that I think they're not anymore. I think it was Jessica who was talking earlier about one of the weaknesses of the United States is that we're very inwardly focused all the time, and we don't have this global perspective. And I think that that's a disadvantage for America. And it's part of our vulnerability that I think some of our not so friendly friends out there want to try to exploit, because we're so focused on ourselves. And I think one way to start to change that is by exposing people, even at the youngest ages, to the world. And that can be probably best done through education. And I'll stop there and give Jessica an opportunity.
Yeah, I don't think I much more to add. I have a hard stop, unfortunately, at 1:20. So if you have any final questions for me, otherwise, I'm happy to stay in touch with the students directly. Thanks.
Thank you again for your time, Jessica. We definitely appreciate that and your insights. So definitely want to say that before you have to go.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. So I'll leave you with this last question, which is how to move toward a social justice and racial equity framework instead of having it, reside in a diversity inclusion space. How do we move out of that space into social justice and racial equity? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are groups like the Sunrise Movement that, is really talking about climate change in a way that resonates with a lot of ordinary Americans. And that's why they're such a big grassroots, organization. And so, linking kind of domestic and foreign policy to social justice, racial justice, I think is the work of our generation. I mean, this is the conversation we need to have because the longer we prolong this, the more that, we're going to see communities of color being adversely affected. And, I think it's really important for not just people at mid or senior level, but, younger people too. I mean, the UN association example that Asha, mentioned repeatedly is a good one where you can just sort of join these organizations and, at any level. And try to be heard. I think we also need to do a better job as communities of color to link our various lived experiences with one another to make an even more powerful argument. Because I know as an API community organizer, a lot of Asian Americans are sort of grappling with our own issues, and thinking like, oh man, wouldn't it be great to have more allies? And it's like, well, yeah, they're like civil rights advocates in the Black community. You should be like directly inspired by, you should be bringing them on, and they should be really helping you tell your story, and so I think there's a lot of that needs to happen as well. So it's I think the work that our audience is going to be helping us do in the coming years, and certainly something that I'd also like to be part of. So I'll stop there because I have another meeting, but thanks for this opportunity, Troy, and to the deans who were involved in hosting. Really appreciate this time.
Well, thank you again. We appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we had some questions in the chat about barriers to entry. One was about age barriers that might exist at state and or at DoD, and another was about someone who may be a community activist or organizer, and whether their position in the community would be looked fondly upon if they went to try to have a career in these fields, or unfavorably. And so if anybody would like to address those questions.
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. Go ahead, Asha.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll be brief. I'll be brief so that you can speak. With respect to barriers to entry in the State Department, there is only one that I can think of, and that is you can't enter after you reach the age of 55 and a half. So if you're interested in joining the Foreign Service, please try to do that before you reach the age of 55 and a half. Otherwise, there's nothing else that would preclude you from entering into the Foreign Service. And with respect to grassroots organizing or activism, being a social justice advocate, I mean, I'm not an HR or human resources professional, but I know for myself, I was quite active in my university, did a lot of protesting, was involved in the student government, did sit-ins and the whole 9 yards on my campus. And I'm also brutally honest. So when I was going through my security clearances and things like that, I told them what I did, and I'm proud of what I did because I felt like it made a difference. And I'm here today, still in the Foreign Service many years later. I think every experience that we have is what makes the State Department richer. And I think your unique perspective and your organizing experience and your opposition to the status quo is kind of exactly what the State Department needs right now. We need more people who are a little bit willing to deviate from the norm, who are willing to push back, and not just because they want to be anti, but because doing things the way we've always done them doesn't necessarily need to be the way that we do them. And so I find myself to be a little bit of a rebel in the State Department because I I don't play devil's advocate just to play devil's advocate, but I always do question, like, is this really the best way to do things? Just because we did it this way before doesn't mean we need to do it this way now. So I think that you shouldn't allow anything to stop you from your pursuit of coming into the Foreign Service. I wouldn't worry about that. I would just be as transparent as possible if you're going through the application process, and know that your experiences are valued and they are necessary and needed. Over to Asha.
Thank you, Leah. I loved your perspective. As far as barriers, there's different ways on joining DoD. First, of course, everybody knows the traditional one as far as being recruited from a recruitment center, and that policy change depends on the age. Sometimes it's last year maybe like 33, the year before is 34. It changes. I've seen it change a lot since I've been in under Bush. But I think where I would like to see more as far as recruitment is more diversity in the officer corps. I think that's something that we definitely need to work on. If you look at it right now, 5% of the officer corps is African American women. So that's something that it's an opportunity, but definitely there's some sort of there's an age limit when it comes to that barrier. But you can also work at DoD as a civil servant. There's a lot of opportunities to apply on. I know some people don't like this website, but it does work as far as USA Jobs, or also meeting with people in DC and networking through them to find out opportunities there too as well. So you can always join as a civil servant. In terms of the next question, I love that question. I'm kind of like I challenge the norms, and sometimes I'm not necessarily someone who goes along with the institution. You'd be surprised I'm saying that too. So I agree with Leah. So what I have done in my career that may be surprising to you guys too as well is that I believe that when it comes to social justice or making a change, sometimes you can't sit around and reform an institution that doesn't want to change. So what I think is pretty amazing now, especially in the 21st century, is creating your own. And if you're looking to work on social justice, I would make sure that whatever you're working on, it's comprehensive. It's more narrow than saying, oh, just diversity, equity, inclusion. Maybe more of, oh, how can we address this specific community and this specific issue. And then, creating your own organization, as well as, using technology to do it as well. I think there's a lot of opportunities to attract people that are like-minded, whether it's through, I don't know, Snapchat, I don't know, they have Clubhouse, they have all these different forums where you can engage with different people, and then you can use that to your advantage to help, support your efforts in terms of social justice. So my advice is to definitely look into probably starting your own if it doesn't necessarily work out, being part of another organization and, and they refuse to like reform itself, or they're just moving really slow. I've gained a lot of respect starting my own organization in my field. So definitely consider it. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're just about out of time here. So I'm going to turn it back over to Troy and to Dean Smith to close us out. And I just want to say thank you so much, panelists. It was an excellent conversation. There's so much love in the chat from everyone who was participating. So I know it was very impactful for all of us, and we very much appreciate your sentiments from the school. Take care.
All right. I just want to say thank you to Leah, Asha, and now she's gone, but Jessica, for just your time, sharing your insights, wisdom, and experience. This was definitely like a great and excellent conversation. As you can see from the chat, I think a lot of people got a lot out of it. I want to thank the audience as well for just taking the time out to come see it. We definitely enjoyed your participation and enthusiasm. Thank you, Dean Halpin, for holding that chat down. And thank you, Dean Smith, for the kind introductions, and just thank you to the school for the support. So thank you all.
There's so many people active in the chat that I can't get to my mic button because there's so many blue boxes passing up. So that goes to show how popular this session was. So I just briefly want to echo the words of thanks to all of the speakers. Learned a huge amount. I have to say the conversation had moments of frustration that we weren't doing better and we're not the example that we think we should, and we have these problems at home that hinder our role in the world. But the focus then shifted through much of the conversation to how we can do better and strategies for doing that. And I really liked that the audience was providing advice to each other, not only the panelists, but just the amount of insights provided in the chat was just huge. One of the issues I follow closely is U.S. engagement to the UN, and the Biden administration has announced that we'd like to engage with the Human Rights Council. And one of the challenges there is that's not just his decision. I mean, you have to run for election, and the U.S. has actually run for and lost elections in an election in the predecessor body, the Human Rights Commission. So it's not a guarantee. And issues like racial injustice in the United States, issues like the insurrection on January 6th, they're going to make that campaign that much harder for the U.S. But I'm hopeful with the insights of our panelists and how they go about doing their work, that Biden and his team and the country as a whole can still lead by an example and be an active role in various multilateral and bilateral negotiations. So we're really a shining example around the world. For those of you who are students at the School of Diplomacy, I know not everyone is, but a number of you are in the attendee list. I just want to highlight that a lot of the resources that were mentioned by the panelists and by the guests, whether that be the Pickering, the Wrangle, the Pain, those are things that our students have experience getting in the past, and we're happy to mentor you for those opportunities. The various networks that were mentioned, the Global Access Pipeline, WCAPS, UNA USA, those are all partners of the school or we're members of those organizations. So we have a lot of resources for you. And finally, just because Leah mentioned it at least twice, the Hometown Diplomat Program. What a perfect timing on that, because one of our graduates from our MA program back in 2006 emailed Dean Sangemino and I overnight. She's in the Foreign Service. She's stationed in Mexico City. She just applied for the Hometown Diplomat Program, got accepted, and wants to do a talk. And so we've connected her to Dr. Ruby. So please be on the lookout for a Hometown Diplomat talk with our alumni, Sonia Fernandez, hopefully sometime later in March or April. So the timing couldn't be perfect to build on that. So without further ado, I want to thank everybody involved in this. Great job, Troy, for organizing the panel. Great job, panelists. And thank you all for an incredibly lively and informative chat session. I feel very good about this event, as do many of you. So thank you all, and best wishes moving forward with our agenda.
And thank you again,